waking up and realizing the last time you saw light might be the last time ever. This man survived 17 days trapped underground, where time stopped and darkness became the enemy. The world above ground moves with quiet certainty. People wake up, walk into sunlight, speak to one another, and assume, without ever thinking about it, that the earth beneath their feet is solid, dependable, permanent. But underground, that certainty disappears. Because beneath the surface, space becomes fragile. Rock becomes temporary, and a single mistake can turn the world into a sealed tomb. In the early 20th century, long before modern rescue technology, one man experienced what may be one of the most psychologically brutal survival ordeals ever recorded. Not on a mountain, not at sea, not in the jungle, but in total darkness, buried alive beneath stone. He would survive there for 17 days, and the most terrifying part was not hunger. It was not thirst. It was not even the crushing weight of the earth above him. It was time itself. Because when there is no light, the human mind loses its only anchor. The cave was not supposed to be dangerous. It was one of many limestone chambers in rural France, explored by workers and locals for years. In that era, caves were not tourist attractions. They were places of labor, places where stone was cut, minerals were gathered, and men entered the earth the way sailors entered the sea, accepting risk as part of life. That morning, the man descended as he had many times before. The air grew cooler. The daylight behind him narrowed into a pale ribbon. And then it vanished. He moved deeper through familiar tunnels, carrying only basic tools and a small lamp. In those days, safety was simple: a flame, a rope, and experience. But underground, experience is not a guarantee, only an illusion. The collapse happened without warning. A sound like thunder, compressed into a single instant. Stone gave way, the ceiling fractured, and the tunnel behind him sealed shut. In seconds, the passage back to the surface was gone. Dust filled the air. The lamp flickered violently, then steadied. And in that brief circle of light, he saw the truth. Rock, debris, no opening, no path, just a wall of earth where freedom had been. At first, the mind refuses reality. He shouted. He struck the stones. He listened for movement. But the cave answered only with silence. Above him, life continued. People spoke, worked, ate meals. But underground, he had become invisible, a man erased. When the lamp finally died, darkness became absolute. Not the darkness of night, not the darkness of a closed room, but the kind of darkness that has weight. A darkness so complete that even the concept of sight becomes meaningless. He could wave his hand inches from his face and see nothing. In that environment, the body reacts as if the universe has ended. There is no horizon, no distance, no sense of direction, only breath, heartbeat, and stone. And then the first true enemy arrived. Not hunger, not thirst, panic. Because panic underground is not just fear. It is oxygen wasted, energy burned, madness approaching. To survive, he had to do what most people cannot. He had to become still. Water was his first concern. The human body can endure hunger far longer than thirst. In the dark, he searched by touch, crawling along the damp rock walls, feeling for moisture. Limestone caves sometimes weep water slowly, forming tiny droplets. He found them. Not enough to drink freely, only enough to gather with patience. A few drops at a time, hours of effort for a mouthful. Time became strange. Without sunlight, he could not measure days, only cycles of exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments. Waking came in confusion. He began to lose the boundary between dreaming and reality. Food was almost non-existent. There were no plants, no animals, only stone. He carried small scraps in his pocket, perhaps a piece of bread. It was gone quickly. After that, hunger became a dull ache, then a distant emptiness. But hunger was not what broke him. Darkness breaks people differently. Darkness attacks the mind. In the absence of sound, the brain creates it. In the absence of movement, the brain imagines it. He began to hear things, faint echoes, whispers, footsteps that were not real. He had to fight not only for survival, but for sanity. Above ground, rescuers searched, but caves do not give up their dead easily. In the early 1900s, there were no infrared cameras, no listening devices, no drilling equipment. Only men with lanterns digging by hand, uncertain where the collapse had even occurred. Every hour that passed reduced the chance of survival, because underground, air itself becomes limited. Yet somehow the trapped man endured. He conserved breath. He moved as little as possible. He treated each drop of water as a victory, each moment of calm as resistance. At some point, hope becomes dangerous, because hope imagines rescue, and imagined rescue makes the silence louder. So instead, he did something colder, something stronger. He accepted the possibility that no one was coming, and in that acceptance, he gained control. Survival is not always about optimism. Sometimes survival is simply refusal. Refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. Day after day, though he could not count them, he remained in the dark, a living human presence sealed beneath the world. On the 17th day, the sound arrived, not imagined, real, a faint odor, then another, stone shifting, voices, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. For the first time in over 2 weeks, the universe expanded beyond his own breath. Rescuers had finally reached the collapse point. They dug through debris, widening the gap. Light pierced into the chamber like something holy, not bright at first, just a thin blade. But to someone who has lived without sight, it was overwhelming. He wept, not from joy alone, but from the shock of returning to existence. When they pulled him out, he was barely recognizable. Starved, weak, his skin pale from the absence of sun, his eyes unable to tolerate brightness. But alive. 17 days underground. 17 days in darkness, so complete that time dissolved. And yet he endured. Most survival stories are told in landscapes we can imagine. Oceans, mountains, snow, deserts. But this story forces a different question. What happens when survival is not against nature's violence, but against nature's silence? Because underground, the earth does not attack you. It simply forgets you. And the human mind, left alone with nothing but darkness, becomes its own wilderness. That is what this man survived, not just hunger, not just thirst, but the crushing psychological weight of being buried alive in a world without light. Some people survive storms, some survive cold, and some survive something even more terrifying: nothingness. Rescue is often imagined as an ending, a moment of triumph, a door opening, a body pulled back into sunlight. But for those who survive the deepest forms of isolation, rescue is not a clean conclusion. It is another kind of beginning, because when a human being has lived in total darkness, sealed away from time, sound, and the normal shape of reality, returning to the world can feel less like salvation and more like shock. When they brought him out of the cave, people expected gratitude, relief, a survivor's smile. Instead, what they saw was something quieter and stranger, a man blinking uncontrollably beneath the open sky. His eyes, deprived of light for over 2 weeks, could barely process brightness. His body trembled, not only from weakness, but from sensory overload. Wind against skin, voices from every direction, space without walls. Even air moving freely felt unfamiliar. For 17 days, his world had been measured in inches. Now it was infinite, and infinity can be terrifying. In the days that followed, doctors focused on the physical: dehydration, starvation, the slow return of strength. But the deeper injury was harder to name, because the mind does not leave darkness unchanged. In the early 20th century, psychological trauma was not yet a language people used easily. There were no terms like post-traumatic stress, no understanding of what prolonged sensory deprivation does to the brain. Survivors were expected to return to normal, to be thankful, to move on. But underground survival is not something you simply move on from. Even after his body recovered, the cave remained inside him. He struggled with sleep. Darkness no longer felt neutral. It felt alive. Night became a reminder, not a rest. Silence became unbearable. Some survivors of entrapment describe a permanent shift in perception, as if the world above ground becomes fragile, as if walls are no longer just walls, but potential tombs. He avoided enclosed spaces. He's startled at sudden sounds. He carried quietly the memory of being erased from the surface of the earth. Not dead, just unreachable. People around him turned the story into something simpler. A miracle, a headline, a tale of endurance. They spoke of him as if survival was a kind of heroic performance. But survival is not performance. Survival is often private, ugly, slow, full of moments where the human mind almost breaks. What the public saw was the number, 17 days. What they did not see was what those days contained. The hallucinations, the thirst, the loss of time, the intimate closeness of stone. And yet stories like this mattered, because the industrial age was driving humanity underground more than ever before. Mines expanded, tunnels lengthened, cities grew upward while workers disappeared downward. Progress required men to enter the earth, to carve it open, to pull resources from darkness. Coal, stone, metal. The modern world was being built beneath the surface, and the deeper civilization dug, the more it confronted a truth it did not want to face, that technology could expand human power, but not remove human vulnerability. A collapse could still turn progress into burial. In the years after, cave exploration and mining slowly became safer. Not because nature became kinder, but because stories like his forced people to pay attention, forced them to imagine what it meant to be trapped. Rescue methods improved, structural knowledge advanced. The underground became gradually less invisible. His survival was not just personal, it was a warning delivered from below, a reminder that the modern world, for all its machinery, still rests on fragile ground. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was psychological, because his ordeal reveals something uncomfortable about human existence. That survival is not always about fighting something dramatic. Sometimes the most brutal enemy is absence. No light, no sound, no time, no witness. The fear of being forgotten, the fear that the world will continue without ever knowing you vanished. And yet, he endured, not through strength alone, but through stillness, through patience, through the refusal to let the mind collapse before the stone did. Most people will never be trapped underground, but everyone at some point will face a kind of darkness, a silence, a confinement, a stretch of time where the future cannot be seen. And this is why the story remains powerful, because it is not only about a cave, it is about the human mind pressed against the edge of nothingness and choosing somehow to remain alive. There is a reason stories like this remain in the human imagination. Not because they are rare, but because they reveal something ordinary people spend their entire lives trying not to think about. How thin the surface really is, how quickly the familiar world can vanish. One moment you are walking forward, surrounded by routine, light, certainty, and the next you are somewhere the world cannot reach, buried not only beneath stone, but beneath silence. Modern civilization is built on the belief that we are in control, that we have engineered safety into existence, that progress has tamed the unknown. But underground progress becomes humble, because rock does not negotiate, darkness does not care what century it is, and the earth, when it closes, closes completely. In that sense, the cave is not just a place, it is a reminder that beneath everything we build, there is still nature, still fragility, still the possibility of disappearance. And yet, the most important truth of this story is not the collapse. It is not even the rescue. It is what happened in between, the 17 days when no one could see him, when time lost its meaning, when the human mind began to fray at the edges. In that space, survival was no longer physical, it was existential. It was the decision to remain present in a world that had become nothing but breath and darkness. Because in the deepest isolation, something is revealed, that survival is not always a fight. Sometimes it is endurance without movement. Sometimes it is patience without reward. Sometimes it is simply refusing to let the mind surrender, even when the body's trapped. That is what he did. He did not conquer the cave. He did not defeat nature. He simply stayed alive inside it. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Because most people will never face a collapse of stone, but many will face collapses of another kind. A season of darkness, a silence that feels endless, a stretch of time where the future cannot be seen. In those moments, survival does not look heroic. It looks quiet. It looks like one more breath, one more hour, one more decision not to disappear. The world remembers disasters. It remembers numbers. But what it rarely remembers is the invisible human experience inside them. The long minutes, the doubt, the loneliness, the psychological weight of being alive and unreachable. This man survived that, and in doing so, he left behind something more than a miracle. He left behind a message from the dark, that even when the world cannot find you, even when time dissolves, even when nothing surrounds you but stone, life can remain, not loudly, not dramatically, but stubbornly, silently, still breathing.